Well, there are so many of them. I think most Americans, if asked to name someone associated with the Underground Railroad, probably could only name Harriet Tubman, and some would perhaps also name Frederick Douglass. Both good people to name, of course. But nonetheless, as important and as fascinating as these two individuals were, there was a multitude. There were certainly thousands and probably a few tens of thousands of Americans involved in Underground Railroad activity from its early days at the end of the 1790s right up to the Civil War. And many of them were really remarkable people. I mean, one of the most vivid in my own mind is Isaac Tatum Hopper, who was a Quaker, a feisty, two-fisted Quaker, so to speak, who began doing what we now call underground activity in Philadelphia in the 1790s, initially helping people who were illegally still enslaved in the state of Pennsylvania, bearing in mind that all our states were originally slave states and slavery was legal to some degree in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, most other northern states into the early 19th century. So there were Pennsylvanians who were enslaved but illegally under the state laws at the time. Quakers like Hopper, particularly Hopper, began assisting them to freedom. Hopper was famous for his rather colorful exploits. On one occasion, he jumped on a horse and chased a boat down the Delaware River, a boat that was carrying away a kidnapped black Philadelphia boy to be carried into slavery in Maryland. He chased the boat down the river until its first landfall, ran onto the boat and tore the boy off bodily. And carried him back to Philadelphia in safety. He made a habit of bursting into the homes of people who had illegally kept individuals in bondage. He went to court representing, he wasn't a lawyer, but nonetheless he represented, spoke for enslaved people. He also pioneered techniques that become standard in the Underground Railroad, such as using disguises, disguising men as women, women as men, moving fugitive slaves from one safe house to another, moving people from the city of Philadelphia out to the countryside, or from the countryside to the city. And he went on to have a tremendous personal influence in the development of the Underground Railroad, including, after the 1820s, helping to organize the Underground Railroad in New York City. So Hopper is somebody whose name we all ought to know as readily as we know Harriet Tubman's. Now, someone else, David Ruggles, was a protege of Isaac Tatum Hopper. He was an African-American, born free in Connecticut, very well-educated man, who moved from Connecticut to New York City in the 1820s, established a small business, but really committed himself heart and soul to the education and social betterment of African Americans in New York City, bearing in mind that there were enslaved people in New York until 1827. He, David Ruggles, and Hopper together organized the Underground Railroad, known as the New York Vigilance Committee, in the mid-1830s, and they assisted hundreds, many hundreds of fugitives coming north through New York City, sending them northward up the Hudson Valley to Albany and safety, or out to Long Island, to Connecticut, to New Bedford, Massachusetts. David Ruggles, again, I find a particularly exciting figure because he was bold, tough, confrontational. There was nothing deferential in his style of working. He was, as I said, born free, and he thought of himself as a free man, and he would simply not brook being treated coarsely by American racism. He is also notable for many things, but he was the person to whom the terrified runaway Frederick Bailey came on his flight north. Frederick Bailey, after Ruggles has taken him in, brought his wife north from Maryland, seen them married in his own home, Ruggles' home in New York City, given them a few dollars and put them on a boat to New Bedford. That man becomes Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass, the most towering figure of the black anti-slavery movement, became who he was thanks to David Ruggles. If he had not made it to Ruggles' home in New York City, in the safe embrace of the Underground Railroad, he might easily have been swept up by slave hunters in New York. He was near despair before he was directed to Ruggles' home. Ruggles, as I said, liberated many, many people. A third individual who we all ought to know about is a man named Jermaine Logan, whose exploits are also pretty dramatic. He was a fugitive slave himself. He escaped from Tennessee on horseback, rode in the dead of winter all the way to Canada. A fascinating aspect of his escape was that he had been given some advice by a sympathetic white man in Tennessee, not an Underground Railroad figure, but somebody who was happy to see slaves run away from their masters. He just didn't like slavery. He advised Logan and his companion to ride up boldly to the biggest house in any town they entered, knock on the front door and offer to pay for a place to sleep. He said, act like a free man and nobody will think you're a fugitive slave. And that worked quite well for him, almost until he reached the Ohio River. At any rate, he had many more adventures, went to Canada, farmed for a while, then returned to the United States, became educated, and became a fiery abolitionist preacher in upstate New York, and became the head of the Underground Railroad in the intensely abolitionist city of Syracuse, New York in the 1850s. He led a huge crowd in Syracuse to rescue a fugitive slave, Jerry Henry, from literally the physical embrace of the federal commissioner who was about to send him back south. Logan also was extremely bold. He advertised his address in newspapers in Syracuse. He had business cards that identified him as station master, Underground Railroad. He held fundraisers in the city council chambers in Syracuse. He was afraid of no one. He dared his former masters to come and take him in Syracuse. So there are so many stories like that, but those are a few.